Welcome back to the Douglas Murray channel. In this engaging discussion, Douglas Murray delves into the complexities and challenges surrounding free speech today. Well, let's dive in.
Offend. Now, joining me from New York, I'm joined by Conservative author Douglas Murray. To quote Piers Morgan, Douglas, has the world gone nuts, my friend?
I would ask a different question, if I may. You said at the beginning, is there any limit to free speech? And I'm rather disturbed we're still discussing this. It's 3 decades and more since the Satanic Verses affair. It was in 1989 that the Ayatollah Khomeini did the unpardonable, unforgivable thing of calling for the murder of a British novelist for the crime of writing a novel. And we had these debates back then. Where are the limits to free speech? Has Mr. Rushdie committed a crime as well as the Ayatollah? And a lot more guff like that. I'm rather disturbed that in all of the decades since, with all of the people who've been killed for asserting their right to free speech, or asserting their right to say what they think and for the rest of us to hear it, but we're still at this elementary playground level of discussion. I'm sorry to say that, but this is a long answered question. Our societies have perfectly good incitement laws in place. The rest of it, I'm sorry, no, we're not adapting our own speech codes. We're not going to make ourselves more sensitive to people who famously burn books that they can't even read. I mean, the Ayatollah Khomeini had never even read the Satanic Verses when he asked for Muslims around the world to kill Salman Rushdie. It's an unpardonable thing that has happened. It is extraordinary to me that we're still having this discussion. Mm-hmm. We had the same discussion 7 years ago when the cartoonists of Charlie Hebdo were being murdered. We had the same discussion in all of these decades, and it's Muslims and non-Muslims who've been attacked. And we in the West still have this pathetic discussion about, oh, what are the limits of free speech? Really, we've got to get better than that.
Douglas Murray criticizes the ongoing debate about the limits of free speech, referencing the Salman Rushdie affair. He argues that societies should have established clear incitement laws by now. Murray emphasizes the absurdity of adopting speech codes to appease those who threaten violence. How can societies effectively balance the protection of free speech with addressing incitement and threats?
Douglas, I agree with you, but it's not just Islam, is it? We'll talk to Abdul Al-Andalusi in a minute. But it's also comedy. We talked about Dave Chappelle, we talked about Jimmy Carr. There doesn't seem to be a week that goes by without some comedian making a joke that a certain group, a certain number of people find distasteful. I obviously
that might be true.
I obviously come from a different planet, because here's what I would say. We have an on-off button. If you want to go and see a comedian, you buy a ticket. If you want to watch a television programme, you pick that channel. If you want to read Salman Rushdie's book, you surely have a right. Are we not getting to the point where free speech is under attack in our world, in our nation?
It's been under attack for a long time. I don't particularly care for a lot of the sort of belly aching and complaining on rather frivolous online stuff that I hear from a lot of authors and others. I think that people have to toughen up a bit on some of that. But the Rushdie affair has always been in a different class, and there's a reason for that. And there's a reason why so many people today are willing to make death threats against authors and others for all sorts of things, including comedians. And it's because they saw that it works. Yeah. It works. When the Ayatollah called for the murder of Salman Rushdie, people on the left and right of British politics and of British culture made excuses for the fatwa. I'm sure we'll hear some excuses today. They learned, our societies learned, that if somebody says, I'm offended, and then says, and as a result, I'm going to kill, you better be damn sure that you're willing to die for that. And unfortunately, the success of the Ayatollah's fatwa, among other things, is that it showed a load of other disgruntled people what they could do if they only had the disgustingness to think that they could exercise violence as an opposition to the pen. And I'm afraid that what happened, as I say, is that Muslim extremists across the UK and across the world showed they could intimidate people, and others undoubtedly have learned from this. But let's remember, Britain in 1989, we allowed Muslims in Bradford to burn the Quran, the satanic verses on the streets of Britain. We allowed prominent figures like Cat Stevens to excuse the murder of Salman Rushdie on the television. We allowed Iranian officials who had called for Rushdie's murder to live in London. Like, how stupid are we?
Interesting.
The discussion broadens to include the controversy surrounding comedians like Dave Chappelle. Murray argues that free speech is under threat, pointing out that death threats against public figures are a consequence of violent intimidation. He references the fatwa against Rushdie as a pivotal example. How can society ensure the protection of free speech while addressing the grievances of the offended?
For restrictions on, for platforms for Muslim speakers going to universities. He wanted to ban the burqa in public buildings and a kind of social ban on it in public. So for him, and argued that conditions for Muslims in Europe must be made harder across the board.
Let's bring Douglas back in. Douglas, wait.
I find it a little. I find it a little bit strange that he should deign to call himself, brazenly call himself or at least imply some kind of champion for free speech or free expression.
Look, I've probably got to answer that. You'll have noticed, and all of your viewers will have noticed, that this Islamist lunatic in your studio can't answer the basic question. Let's try it again and make it simple for you. Why don't you say whether or not you are completely condemning of any violence against Salman Rushdie or anyone else who is deemed to have said something heretical? Why don't we start with the basics for you?
Okay, firstly, I want to answer his question, because he asked me first, which is about the Iranian regime. Well, having not being an Iranian citizen nor participated in any elections to elect the Iranian regime, the Iranian regime doesn't really represent 1.8 billion Muslims. And
okay, so if you're here representing 1.8 billion Muslims, it's very simple. Douglas has just said it. All right, as your own self, having heard what he said, do you accept people saying, be it the Iranian government or Muslim extremists, and I made the caveat and I repeat it, Muslim extremists, that one of the biggest problems I have is that people look at the whole thing and they shouldn't. Do you agree with anybody who comes up with the sentence, he was to blame for being knifed in broad daylight 15 times in his neck? Do you?
The only person to blame for the knifing of Salman Rushdie is the assailant himself.
Not the Iranian regime who put the fatwa on him in the first place.
Well, unless you can demonstrate that they were specifically colluding or they sent an agent.
They
said he was to blame.
He was in communication with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard.
That's their opinion, right? But I'm only here to talk about, if you're asking me who's to blame, I say the assailant, much like Douglas Murray said that the Christchurch killer, the one who massacred the Muslims in the mosque, only the killer was to blame, not those who radicalized him into viewing Muslims as a threat to the West.
What you'll find is that if somebody put millions of dollars on someone's head, yours, for instance, or mine, and somebody then attacked us, you would think that the person who had put millions of dollars on our head would bear some responsibility. But because you're such a dishonest weasel, you're not even willing to do that. You're not even willing to do the basic thing of condemning the attack.
Sticks and stones, Douglas Murray, sticks and stones.
Why don't we
You need to demonstrate that the person was motivated by the reward.
I'll tell you what I'd like to motivate. I'll tell you what I'd like.
The debate touches on restrictions for Muslim speakers and the burqa ban, questioning the consistency of free speech advocacy. Murray challenges an Islamist guest to condemn violence against Rushdie and others unequivocally. He highlights the issue of excusing violence based on offense. What are the implications of failing to universally condemn violence in the name of free speech and religious sensitivities? The conversation underscores the ongoing struggle to balance free speech with societal and religious sensitivities, highlighting the need for clear and consistent stances against violence. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more exciting debates. Until next time.